Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first ever UUMA Connect webinar. My name is Allison Palm, and I'm on staff with the UUMA, and I believe almost all of our speakers are here. We're waiting for one more, and in just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to Tom Shade, who is going to be leading you through this webinar. Tom, are you there? He's not quite here yet.
He's coming back.
There he is. Hi, Tom.
Well, while we're waiting for Tom, I will go ahead and start for us. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Kirk. I am the Frank and Alice Schulman Professor of Unitarian Universalist History here at Meadville Lombard Theological School, and many of you know me as a colleague, parish minister for many years as well. And I was delighted when Tom reached out and asked me to join you all for one of the first. Is this the first, Allison? Is this the first UUMA Connect webinar? So we are on the fly, also playing with some of the technology. And the topic is related to the topic that I've agreed to offer at the Institute. And so we're going to be playing with it in some aspects in a more conversational style. And of course, it's about sacred space and changing faith. Some of the questions that we posted about ministry taking place in all types of spaces, and how does this change our relationship with buildings and spaces when the worship is happening in things from coffee shops to strip malls. And it's been happening for some time. But in our tradition, not so much. There's always outlier examples. But the majority have either used buildings that were adapted from a different tradition, congregationalism, that's a part of our heritage, or built new, especially so many in the last few years, and then that's a period during the fellowship movement. Ooh, and I'm not sure if are we still? I think we are, yes. So talking about how is a space sacred, and how is it different than a traditional church architecture, and when is gained or what is lost. One of the things that brought me to this topic was not only my service as parish minister, but also as an academic. The book I'm working on is about a department store merchant prince named John Wanamaker in Philadelphia, and he had this enormous, beautiful department store, much like Marshall Field's here in Chicago or Filene's in Boston. In fact, they all had the same architect, Daniel Burnham. But what was different about Wanamaker's is this grand court that had a 3-story golden organ that he had purchased from the St. Louis Exposition and had installed and expanded, and had a golden angel on top. And he started to have a series of traditional rituals that would happen during the holidays. Yes, to sell more things out of his department store, but as well to bring Protestant Christianity in this public space. He was a devout Presbyterian, built many churches, was a church leader, the first paid secretary of the YMCA, deeply involved in the evangelical Christian movement here in North America, and the missionary movements across the world in the late 19th and early 20th century. So these are some of the things that I've been interested in and brought me to this topic. But I didn't want to have this conversation alone, because I also care very much about our congregations. When I was first called to my congregation in Ohio, we were on the move already. I joined them just as they were finishing a brand new building, and had the honor and privilege of working with them to leave the old building. They had been there for 37 years and make the move to the new building. I think we have Tom Shade on. Is that true? Tom, are you back on? Yes. And that's for me to continue on, or? Yes. Okay. We're just working out some of the little knots in the system. But one of the things I thought would be very interesting is to ask some colleagues to join me in this conversation. And so today we have David Schwartz. He's one of the co-ministers at First Unitarian Church of Hyde Park. There he is. And we also, next to me, Alan Taylor from Unity Temple, Oak Park. These are two dear colleagues. I'm just getting to know David, and I've known Alan for, we won't count the years, but I think it's around 18 years. And Alan and I have been having an ongoing conversation, and so this came up. And one of the things, David, Facebook, social media, he posted recently, very recently, a comment talking about working for Target, and had some questions around that, which I'm going to bring up here in a moment. One of the problems with sacred space is that some scholars argue it's now so overused that it's become a meaningless category. It doesn't help in any way. Also, it's often broken into this very binary approach of profane and sacred. and so that's not very helpful as well. But a lot of scholars have pushed back recently in saying, no, this is actually a relevant category and that it deserves our attention, but we have to open up our understanding. And there's many ways places become sacred. It can be through memory and tradition. There is a way that it shows itself to be special. There's also people declaring it. Have you ever gone to a place and it seemed like an average field, and then you go over to a marker and realize it's a Civil War battle site, and your feeling changes about how this is experienced. So how does that work in our congregations where we have older church buildings that the architecture says church, but can really constrain how we do church in some newer forms? And how does that work in strip malls and coffee shops and different places? What makes a space sacred? And we're still trying to figure some things out here to get Tom where we can hear him. And how can we think about this in creative ways as we move forward as Unitarian Universalists? So I'm going to go ahead and bring in David's comment that he made on Facebook, because I want to invite Alan and David in. David talked about his experience as a training strategist for Target Corporation between 2012 and 2013. And the company was looking into a multi-channel transformation. How would the retailer evolve to thrive in a retail environment profoundly changed by e-commerce, mobile tech, and social networks? And you can drop in church instead in that sentence and say, how can a church evolve to thrive in this new environment profoundly changed by mobile technology and social networks and social media? And it doesn't, and so he went on in this post and said, it doesn't disclose anything to say that the single biggest question in the process was always, how do we make our stores a unique competitive advantage in this new world? Yes, the web and mobile presence need to be excellent, but a key question is always about how to evolve the experience. And so it's same is true for the church in the digital age. Yes, we've got to have a good web presence and acknowledge the digital world necessarily changes what congregations should focus on, but we should ask the hard questions about how people have changed and how we have to change. And he has a very important question for me and a lot of others, is that we absolutely want to expand and think about new ways of doing church, but also we have churches in buildings with all the infrastructure already in place. And so how can those places continue to thrive? Not only the ones that are thriving currently, our breakthrough congregations and many others, but the ones who are on the tipping point of maybe falling the other way and crumbling, and how we can bring them forward and changing our ideas of sacred space. So David, are you on? Can you hear me, David? And Tom? I'm getting... Oh, I think they might all be coming down to my office to squeeze in around my computer.
Yeah, so just so everyone knows, this is the first time any of us are using this technology, and we are doing our best and appreciate your patience. But I I think maybe Tom and David should head over to Nicole because they're actually all in the same building. Um,
Yes,
so get cozy in Nicole's office and and you can have your conversation on one screen.
great. Thank you, Allison. No, I think because we're all hooked up here, so we're all gonna squeeze around my desk. This is gonna be fun. Again, thank you, everyone. I mean, all of us, I think, have used Google Hangouts for other things, but doing it for this platform for a webinar is a little bit different. And I was being a little old-fashioned. I invited everybody down to Meadville so we could all be talking to each other as we were figuring this out. And it looks like old-fashioned can help sometimes. So I'll see if they're coming down. But I'll go ahead and talk a little bit more. So architecture has its power. Certainly buildings that have steeples or profound presence. One historian, Peter Brown, talks about a building as an argument in stone, and that there's a theology to architecture. But sacred space is multi-layered, and so it's not only what people officially say it is, the architect per se, it's also more than what a minister may talk about in a dedication ceremony or in sermons over the years. It's also what the people experience it as and their reception of it. And that's all culturally constructed. What we think is holy versus or sacred versus what is noise. They've been doing this along the lines of sound, about how church bells, a lot of people, oh, they're so sweet, and there's actually a whole legal history where people didn't think church bells are so sweet, and they wanted to stop the sound. And we have that also with the call to prayer in Islamic mosques, Muslim mosques across this country, and having to figure out ways to become a part of the religious landscape and where people are pushing back. David, are you with us now? I think you're going to have to come on over. Come on over.
He is with us.
Oh. Well, anyway. So, and I've been kind of talking there. One of the things that Alan and I talked about is it's more than just the building. It's more than just the architecture. Certainly ritual is a big part of what makes a space sacred. It's in what you do there in that space over time. But Alan had some really great thoughts about what ministers bring to the space.
Yeah, I have the privilege to serve in a architecturally wonderful space, Unity Temple. But ultimately, I don't think it's the architecture that is what's essential. What I think is essential is the emotional presence of the minister. Now, it's true that the architecture can amplify that presence, but truly, when one of us steps into a space and speaks honestly from a sense of authority, our own authority, our own experience, our and especially when we move into narrative sharing, that that we're able to connect with people in a way that calls forth the sacred. That the reason why I told Nicole that I would come in is because I think sacred space isn't simply created by what you put out, but is made sacred by what is brought in. And certainly what is put out can amplify and transform a space. When I was in the Seattle area, I remember the Bainbridge Island congregation meeting in a school. And I have never seen such a beautiful setup for worship in what would have been a very simple, basic building. And so certainly that set the tone and place for worship, but it comes alive when there's people, minister or laity, coming forth to share and to connect, that the connections, the sacred space is made sacred by when connection is made possible,
Mm-hmm.
when there's that invitation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then we know that can happen in a variety of ways. I've been so impressed with what's been happening with the Church of the Larger Fellowship and their ever increasing adaptations, adoptions, and skill with social media and bringing the Church of the Larger Fellowship, which has been around for a very long time, even closer together in my experience. David, did you want to add in? And I'm not sure if I can rotate this. Oh, I can. Look at that. And I'm going to see my children's paintings.
Hey everyone, sorry for technical difficulties that made me pop up and disappear several times in the last 10 minutes. You know what, I was just thinking, responding to what Alan said, I remember doing a bunch of supply up in St. Cloud, Minnesota. It was a little fellowship that rented office space. I mean, literally, it was the basement floor of a 4-story office building. They had maybe 1,800 square feet. And you know, they had brought everything that they could to transform the space in some way. I mean, to make it, you know, as much as they could, a space that was also sort of set apart from the world. So you go down the elevator in an office building, sort of dodging dentists' offices and CPAs, but there's also something that's happening when you're crossing that threshold. So I totally agree with you. And what Alan was saying about it's what we're bringing to the space that's making it. But at the same time, I also think, all right, how do we set that up as best we possibly can to make that possible, so that you don't have to fight the space. Mm-hmm. I think about that a lot too. So this has been my first year now, along with Terry Schwartz, my spouse and co-minister at First Unitarian Church of Chicago, which is this big Gothic. Or actually, a very small Gothic cathedral. But it is the churchiest church you can possibly imagine. I grew up in this little plain, white-walled New England church, and it's taken some adjustment this year to really think through it. How do we do this? How do we even preach in a way where we're telling stories, but the way that you tell a story, like the way to open up in that space, almost. It's a different kind of a space. It's a different way of telling the story in that space than you might, you know, around a campfire or in a white-walled New England church or in a Frank Lloyd Wright church. And I mean, it's the same thing at the heart of it, but there's still a way where I feel like we've tried to figure out how do we adapt to the architecture of the place so that what we're doing isn't fighting it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I did think of this. I thought, oh goodness, I've invited 2 colleagues from architecturally prominent congregations, but I served for 8 years a church that's new building. A new building was finished, and we moved in 1998. We had been in an old mansion for, as I said, almost 4 decades. I experienced that place for 3 months with them. And then we moved to a very different building full of light and air and a tall ceiling instead of crammed into a living room of an old 1920s mansion. But that mansion had been precious. Talking about sacred space, we all hear those arguments as colleagues, especially when it comes to moving a building about the churches, the people, not the building. We had some of this tension around the move from 25 Beacon Street to 24th Farnsworth. And people being in uproar. Although I thought it was interesting, a few people, when they found out we'd only been at that 25 Beacon building, same address, different building since 1927, some of the fervor backed off a little bit. I thought that was interesting. And so I was in this very modern building, but my home congregation was a more traditional setting, so there was adjustments for me as well. And the more we did, in terms of church services and ritual, certainly helped to do that, but it was almost too plain, and so there was a big argument of how to bring warmth, not only with people, but with beauty. And in looking back, wishing we had even larger conversations about it, because again, it's culturally constructed of what's beautiful, and as we really think about being more welcoming and in a multicultural sense, opening up ideas of beauty and space and how it's used, and how it's experienced in worship is so important, and to expand that. And I certainly get that reading through literature and having experienced other congregations in other places, that you first walk in and you're like, oh, this space is almost ugly. but then something's happening there. In fact, that's one of the things Alan shared with me on his experience going to Carlton Pearson's church.
Yeah, here in Carlton is now here in Chicago, and he holds services. He streams services nationally from the Congress Hotel, which is just a couple blocks from where we are right now, here at Meadville Lombard.
Yeah.
And from this hotel room, that's not all that unlike the rooms that we gather in each year for GA and for ministry days. Rooms that I could argue that it's even less of a sacred space than some of the rooms we gather in. But and yet there's a tremendous presence that Carlton Pearson brings with him to the people he meets, as well as to that space that livens it up. And of course, there's a lot of attention to detail. I don't want to say that it's just the personality, but there's a lot of attention to the detail, to the music, and to what is said, what is spoken, and how it's spoken. That there's. But I find Carlton a master of bringing an emotional presence to bear, and that connects people with him and with themselves, because that's ultimately what we're doing is helping people to in worship to not just connect to what we're saying. It's not that we're trying to say what's right. No, we're trying to say what's true in a way that allows others to connect with who they are, and for there to be connections among us as well, because that's ultimately where I find the divine residing. It's within, among, and beyond us.
Yeah.
In all sorts of ways that we can't actually see.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tom, are you there?
Almost. I can see you, but I can't see me. But
we can see you half your head.
So it sounds like you guys are doing well on this already. I got this thing on my page here that's just all right. Return. I don't have a question right at the moment.
Well, I was thinking about what Alan just shared, and I think that's also going to be changing how we do ministry. We're thinking about this here a lot at Meadville Lombard and our ministerial formation of our students, and just in a conversation the other day with Meg Riley, what it takes in different spaces, whether it's virtual space or in a strip mall, which many people have already done, or coffee shops, etc. What kind of stylistic changes do we have to make? Is it the same old, same old? You know, and I'm not talking about necessarily how we're going to change the sermon. Is it going to go to homily, or what the elements are? But even just our self-presentation as ministers, what dispositions emphasize? Is that changing or not? And David looks like he has some thoughts about this.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Now we'll throw to the weather guy on the other stage here. So I made a face, and Nicole saw my face. But my face was basically this, which is, I feel like this makes me a curmudgeonly old man to say it, but I'll say it anyways. Which is, I think it's a really, really interesting question for conversation to say, what does it mean to worship in a strip mall? How do you make that space, a space that works for worship? At the same time, I feel, for my own call right now, that I'm so attentive to the practical question of the space that I have, and not the theoretical question, which is interesting and fascinating and fun to debate and discuss and throw out there, and is a real question for a good crew of folks out there. But I feel like, to me, the more pointed question is is not to say how do we solve this for all space, but to say no, no, no. All right, you have your space, whatever it is. How do you make it work in that space?
Mm-hmm.
So
Great.
that's that.
Well, of course, I like that, David. Oh, Tommy, you want to jump in?
Yeah, can you just break that question down a little bit to, just, I don't know if you've talked about your space yet, but what does it mean, and what are the actual questions that you struggle with in terms of making your space work?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I'll be really interested to hear from Alan too, who's in such a different physical space. So we've been at this 1 year now, so I don't want to put out any illusions that we have the final answer at all. But here's sort of the context that we struggle with. So this is a sanctuary that is long, is narrow, and is tall. So the sanctuary seats maybe 180 people. It's not huge, but it's in a row of 5 and a row of 6 going back, however the math works out. 14 rows, 20 rows, something like that. Yeah, 30 rows. In any case, it's long, and it's so. It's also really tall. So we have this 50-foot vaulted ceiling. We have a raised pulpit with the pulpit hat, the sounding board. So one of the major things that we struggled with this year was sound. So in that space for a long time, they've had 2 front speakers on either side of the front of the space, which is fabulous if you're sitting in the first 6 rows, and terrible if you're sitting any further back than that. So we spent a lot of nuts and bolts time with a great electrical engineer kind of guy, and brought in a sound consultant and said, how do we put in new hardware? So how do we put in new speakers halfway back in the sanctuary? How do we do a whole lot of software processing changes that I don't really understand that make the kind of tone that's going out into the space more comprehensible? So that was a big piece of it for us, is like how to make what's being said legible, so that when Terry and I and guest preachers and the choir and kids and our coming of age youth show up to tell their story, people can hear them and engage them. So that's one big piece. Another one that we've really tried to play with this year is to play with how linear the space is. So it's this long, I feel so long, and we sat last August just sitting in services saying, oh, this space needs a recessional. It needs sort of the coming in and the coming out, and there's sort of other aspects of the space that reinforce that. But also to play with the height too. So we did, I'm thinking too like a children's story that we did last fall, where we were talking about how we're made from stardust. Literally the stuff of stars, the stuff of our bodies. And we got helium balloons. We got 4-foot helium balloons, and attached tea lights, electric tea lights to them, and sent them up 50 feet above the chancel, so that the kids could look up and see these stars hanging above them. So this way of, how do we be creative with the space? And then another example for that is getting used to the scale of it too. So we, for the last Sunday of the pledge drive, we told the story of Wangari Maathai planting trees in Kenya. And we had a tree with a 6-foot trunk, and then those big 4-foot leaves from IKEA that we had the kids put onto the tree. So we're sort of at the climax of the story, sort of physically building this tree. And it's this huge thing that when it was in the hallway outside our office, we said, oh my God, this is ridiculous. And when you get it into space, it looks to scale, because an 8-foot tree with an 8-foot radius is to scale. So those are some of the challenges. I mean, just a few off the top of the head of that space.
So you were working with a space that was perhaps bigger than you needed. And so I'm trying to fill the space with the right amount of sound, the right amount of movement, the right amount of props, and so on, right? I mean, a lot of our churches are bigger than their congregation are at the moment. I know of churches that have, that seat couple hundred, and they have fewer than that at worship. And so expanding the space. And then a lot of our congregations, of course, are working in spaces that are that feel small to them, that feel too ordinary. I know First Unitarian Chicago does not feel ordinary.
If only. I think that is the case. It is partly a question of scale, but then I also think it's, one of the things we've tried to think through and continue to really take seriously is how do we use the space in the worship itself? So things like the processional and the recessional. We have the advantage of this Gothic building. So what can we do that uses the space to reflect what we're trying to do in worship? The sense of coming into a space that's set apart from everything around it, and then going back out of it again, for example, which wouldn't necessarily work well in other spaces. And part of it too, for us, is trying to figure out that this whole sort of Gothic thing, and this is so on just our particular space, so I don't mean to drag us into the weeds. But as Laurent Denvote, when he builds this thing in the late 20s and early 30s, has this really particular theory of amazing, cutting-edge modern worship, which is now 80 years old, but then, sort of epitomize how you use the Gothic cathedral to do some things that I really haven't read as much as I should about. But I think part of what we're trying to do is that piece of how do we use the space to physically embody what we're trying to do in worship. Not just to do it to scale or to do it legibly, but to use the space to sort of ritually enact the stuff of what's going on there.
Well, and actually, it wasn't just him. I mean, Neo-Gothic in the 20s. I mean, Princeton University's chapel is another example, and it was happening across the country. This new wave after these dark, heavy Romanesque structures that were very popular, to go to a different type, but a little more light coming off with the stained glass, just depending. I'm going to have Alan actually answer this question in just a moment, and he's ready.
Well, Unity Temple was built by the nephew of Jenkin Lloyd Jones, and it expresses the principles of Unitarianism and Universalism in an extraordinary way, and it's wonderful sound, pulpit where no pew is more than 40 feet away from the pulpit, and there's 9 different places where people can sit. There's 3 balconies and 3 upper balconies, but it's all really compact. So it lends itself to intimate preaching. It lends itself to being able to be. That when I read the sermons now, when I first came, 11 years ago, I'm like, what was I saying? How did they even fly? Why didn't they throw me out? Right? I'm like, but I was just doing the best I could at that time, and folks embraced it, and I'm sure that the architecture was a big part of me being embraced. And I have a theory that one of the reasons why my authority is embraced so well here, where it wasn't in a previous settlement, is the architecture. It's, from the pulpit, it's the only place anyone can see everyone who is there, and that everyone kind of unconsciously knows that. That really architecture is significant. I remember Ron Cook at Star King once said, "Architecture is everything."
Oh.
Well, I don't think that's quite true, but there's some wisdom in that. But to create a sacred space, you do have to really attend to how far are people away. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like, David, in your space when you have some folks, 100 feet away from you, and just stretching out back. It is a different ball game. While at the same time, I've seen the photographs of some of your stories for all ages that make use of puppets and balloons or balloon figures, and that go way up, and and it transforms the space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're just right that every space, whatever space you have to work with it.
Mm-hmm.
Our challenge at Unity Temple is that we can't do rituals where people walk around very much because there's so many stairs.
Mm.
In fact, we're inaccessible to wheelchairs.
Mm. Wow.
Unless you take a contraption that we bought that brings people up, but it's a rather undignified way to go up, and of course most people don't want to do that. They prefer to stay in the cloisters.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still possible to be in worship, but you're not in the major space. But back to this, what multimedia is a growing edge for us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we use projection of images and video at times, but I sense we will be using that more often to engage a wider audience, especially in our Worship for All Ages.
Mm-hmm.
That we don't do it very often, and I would love to have the hymns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean that's a way, a space
looking down.
Yes, to bring people up and singing together. And when the very few times we've done that, our space does not lend itself easily. We've been investing in some ways to make this more possible, but we're not there yet. But that will be of support. When I got to Unity Temple, I said we need a story for all ages every week.
Mm-hmm.
And we bring the kids down, and it's a little odd. People are coming down from all different places, and we have that time. And that does, I think, lend itself to a sacred space that we are here all in worship, and our worship for all ages as the kids come down, but then they go back to their families. And when the pews are only 40 feet away or less, you can see everybody's expressions. You can see everyone. So we make use of that. And then my preaching started out being only manuscript preaching from the pulpit, because it's easy to do it that way. But I found I connect with my people in a different way when I let go of the manuscript. And when I let go of the manuscript, it's important that I get out in front of the pulpit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to see everyone in the top balconies, especially if I start walking around.
Mm-hmm.
But
if you had a projection, then you could be projected, and they say that 99% of the time, if someone can see the person or look at the image on the screen, they go for the screen. So it wouldn't be a distraction. And that way people could continue to have the visibility.
Right. But
it'd be different, but...
Yeah, you're right. You're right. That's something for us to play with.
Yeah.
But I've got a unique setup.
Yes, you do.
But one which we don't have to do a lot to make it meaningful.
Mm-hmm. It does. The architecture does a lot of work for you.
Yeah, the architecture does the work for us.
Yeah.
But then again, it's hard to then transform that space into something other than what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Unless we go into Unity House, we used to hold our summer services when they were smaller. There, and did a number of creative types of services and setups there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and not Countryside, that's where I interned at. Seeing Tom makes me think of that common connection. But East Shore in Kirtland, Ohio, with their new building, we could seat 300 in this multi-purpose room. At the time, the congregation was just barely 180, but they built with the vision of welcoming people in the mission. And it gave me incredible flexibility in worship because we had these beautiful movable chairs, and the room was wide and long, but just as equally wide. And so you could do all kinds of things with the chairs and the arrangements, and we would try them this way or that. When we did the Thanksgiving bread service, started by Johnny Robinson at Elliott Chapel, we did a version. We'd have tables going down the center, and everyone looking at each other like they were at a dinner table, and breaking bread with one another. And so there was all this possibility. But also through that ability to change, we also learned what people liked and didn't like. And so people would articulate the Sundays that we had more straight-form chairs that we can't see each other. And in the old building, we could see each other, and this new building, we can. So please have us on a curve. Have us some way that we can have eye contact. That was a part of the worship experience, as well as other ritual elements. And so when Dave was making that face, I mean, but that's the very thing for me as a historian is I think it's so important for all of us, whatever our spaces are, to get down to the history. Do what Peter Rabel taught us long ago and case the church. But in this particular case, so to speak, to look at how the worship space has been used, look at the liturgy, dig into the dedication sermon, see how it was spoken about at that time, interview folks, and to think about that space where it's been, sometimes getting ideas where you can come back to, and then also working, as we all need to, with openness to experiment, to creativity, which inevitably means that we're not going to hit the mark. We're going to make a lot of mistakes, but we're not going to be even able to begin to dream and imagine if we're so, oh, we have to do it this way because this is the way that works, at least for a particular group in the church. But it's not working for this whole other group and the people who haven't come in the door, if we can get them in the door in the first place. So there's all these layers, and again, sacred space being and what is beautiful and how the architecture works, the social constructions around that, the cultural constructions. One of the things I hope to do in the Institute course that I'm offering is to have us think in the particulars, like David started off with, and we got to hear from Alan, and really immersing ourselves in our situations, thinking about that, and then working together to move out. But also, so there's a piece of history, but also visionary. Another thing about sacred space is the visual.
For a second, sorry. We have only about 15 minutes left, and we have some questions coming in from people, and I just want to make sure we're not ignoring those. Can I offer? I think if I do this, can you see that question on the side from Amanda? If you can.
Hi, Amanda.
Why don't you read the question?
I will read the question to you. It says, please discuss. What about creating sacred space in small group gatherings in a cafe or pub theology setting, or spiritual direction in a food court?
Okay, what about creating sacred space in a small group gatherings in a cafe, pub theology setting, or spiritual direction in a food court? That's a great question.
Well, I like the pub theology. Micah's Porch. David Owen O'Quill did such a great job at launching Micah's Porch originally. The gatherings, they didn't really call it a church, it was a gathering before they were a congregation.
Here in Chicago?
Here in Chicago, in a pub.
Yeah.
And meeting in the evening, first monthly gatherings, and then more often. And he's a good example of when I say that, when I talk about creating sacred space through one's emotional presence. David would come, and of course he thought through his sharing before he got there. But he got up there, and it was not a manuscript, and it looked like he was just talking off the cuff. But he was sharing his experience, he was telling stories, and he was bringing wisdom, nuggets of wisdom that connected with young people that ended up creating a congregation, and an exciting congregation.
Do you remember how did he sit in was it in a circle? Did people gather around him? Did he take a particular place? Did he physically, how did that work?
He actually, people were literally sitting at their tables, cocktail tables, and listening to him. This gathering did not include what we would consider, conventional, or, it was not, let's put all the chairs in a circle and feel like we're together. No, this was not, they were not at that place yet. This was a gathering before the congregation has been formed, and he gets up there and shares his some of not even his vision for a congregation, but some of his theology and what we struggle with as a culture and some things that we need to be thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a compelling gathering. I mean, it was a compelling presentation that ended up making a congregational possible.
Was he? Did he like? Was it like? Was he standing in the midst of these? I mean, I'm seeing like a cafe with tables, scattered around the room. Was he standing in the middle? Did he stand at the end? Did he have something he stood behind? Did he have a mic?
Well,
did he just walk around and?
Actually, he stood next to the band.
Okay.
Or in front or the back of the room, depending upon how you're looking at it. I mean, the entrance to the bar, it was in a bar. It wasn't even a cafe. It was a bar, and there was a band, and he stood next to the band. And the band did play. He had music. That was a part of setting the sacred space, was having music that gathered people's attention. Mm-hmm. And then he was able to speak.
Well, that's what I was about to say. It's usually some kind of ritual signal. Sometimes it's through song or emotion. I mean, think about how a church service, but this can also be applied to smaller spaces. And actually, there was a very interesting article after we'd already decided to do this in the Huffington Post about the microchurch. Did you all see this? About the dinner church, and it's in Brooklyn. They only have 1,000 square feet. It's barely the size of my apartment. In some places that's huge, but for a church it's rather small. And the whole idea is to have worship around dinner. And they talked about in the article about what is sacred space, and folks talking about light and quiet and things. But dinner is a central aspect, and so the ritual, everything from what is formal, and so the structure of the service and how they begin the meal and what they do during that time, but also the small things about the utensils are out where people can see them and they're invited to join in and participating in making the table and cleaning up, and it's not just for one person or another. So I think that's really exciting. So in terms of Amanda's question, which I think there's another question that dovetails into that. Where did it go? About the physical, tactile, artistic aspects that could be brought into bear in such spaces. So could you, is that still Amanda? Could you speak about the physical, tactile, artistic aspects that could be brought to these spaces? As well.
Well, the sky's the limit. I mean, it's what David saw up north. I can't remember where you were. What I saw in Bainbridge Island, and in my congregation in Woodinville, Washington, that we were renting space, that it was possible to bring, but it's so often we think just of the scarves that we can have a sense, and yes, that can be helpful.
Pluck down a chalice and a scarf.
But there's so much more possibility.
Absolutely.
Than just, I mean, and certainly the scarves are helpful. But
yeah, right. Part of what this makes me think is sort of going back to what you were saying earlier about that what makes it sacred space is showing up to it and showing up to each other. And I can think of 12-step meetings that happen in bare basements with folding metal chairs with a ceiling that's falling down. That was sacred space from the depth of honesty, real full presence and showing up and sharing. That all right, you think about the space, sure. What's the entrance and the exit to the space? What's like the axis around which the space is turning? How does music work in whatever space you're in? Yeah, good, yes. And I feel like none of that matters if the format and facilitation, if it's a small group, or the worship leadership, if it's worship, doesn't show up to the space and time. And I almost feel like that's I feel like at first Chicago, like part of our strategy is sort of feeling like, all right, but before we think about any of that stuff, we just have to get our house in order. Like if we're going to do small group ministry, we need to spend a solid year or two inviting people into what great small group ministry looks like, and identifying deeply like who are the folks in the congregation who can lead that and make that space possible. It's like once we've got all that set, we'll worry about the space 10 years from now. But I don't mean to be flip in my response, but that's the constellation of what's in my mind.
So we have another question. And Tom, and we're looking for questions, but you want to pop in?
Well, I'm hearing two different things. On one hand, I hear Alan say architecture is everything, or at least quoting someone saying architecture is everything. And then I hear David saying, well, it doesn't really matter if you show up as in the full embodiment of ministry. And obviously people are working hard at both. And as I think of our colleagues out there, I think that we're all showing up. I mean, I think by and large our colleagues show up, and I think they're working really hard with the architecture, but that they have, and a lot of people feel really limited by it. And I don't care. I think people are feeling limited by the, bare strip mall space, and I think people are feeling limited by the fully magnificent space. I mean, when Alan and I have the experience of both working in First Unitarian in Worcester, which is, a magnificent worship space. And yet, that felt in some ways limiting because it's, like you said, it's so much what it is. You can't do anything, or it's hard to do anything except what it programs you to do. So,
but
what I'm
Richard,
hearing, go ahead.
well, and so coming out of my academic work, one of the reasons why I wanted to offer this is partly I'm working on this right now and thinking about space. But how did someone change this department store, Grand Court, this open atrium space, into a place where Philadelphians thought about that they would go for some of their Christmas rituals? And they would go to these great Christmas carol singing time, and they would go and to view these massive paintings of the crucifixion of Jesus that were on display. And people would talk about religious experience that they had in this middle of this department store. But a lot of it, especially the earlier parts, was framed by John Wanamaker, thinking about that ritual and creating ritual in that space that other times was just the floor where you could buy gloves and jewelry. So it was both and, which is so much of sacred space that it's contested, it's unstable, it changes, and you can play with it. But in a tradition that we sometimes struggle with ritual, it can be rather problematic, I think, and that's something I wonder about.
Would you say that if assuming David's point is always valid, it takes ministerial presence to make a space work, that if you have really highly architected space for sacrality, you don't have to worry as much about ritual. But if you're working in a plain space, you need more ritual to compensate for that.
Do you want to pop in? I think we have a new question also about going beyond the walls we have now, but
beyond Christian megachurch.
Yeah, I'll say just really briefly. I mean, I think even in the space that was built for it, you still have to. It has to have integrity, right? It has to hang together. Like I think of, part of what makes grand department store spaces work is like the brand integrity, that what the space is projecting matches the goods that are being sold, matches the staff who are on hand to support the sale, matches the advertising, and sort of the sense of, like in commercial terms, they call it the unified brand. That there's no part of the brand experience that doesn't hang together. And I sort of feel like that and I certainly feel like that in this Gothic space that we have. So that even when we're playing with it, even when we're trying to be creative or push back against it a little, you still have to have integrity with that space. And I think that takes a lot of attention.
And how would that work in the strip mall? The integrity of the space of the strip mall, where a very profound religious experience can happen that people talk about.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly I don't know, but the first place that I would go to is to sort of say, all right, well, if it is the strip mall food court, it's not going to stop being the strip mall food court,
Right.
no matter how many candles you bring. So what then? What does have integrity in that space? I don't know, but I think that idea that I'm lifting up is not fighting the space, not trying to make it something other than what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, David. Yeah, I guess maybe it's Amanda or Mark. I can't tell. What I like about these new questions is they go beyond the usual walls, searching for people who don't like to come inside those walls.
And what models have any of you found other than the megachurch or other Christian models for all this?
Absolutely. There we go.
Well, the commercial space you've been talking about, that's one model, which is an interesting model to consider.
Absolutely. Well, and that's, yeah, sometimes setting yourself up in places that people wouldn't ordinarily think is a religious space. I mean, in thinking about new ways of getting the word out, thinking of new ways of outreach, but also our locations, not expecting people to feel like going inside the doors of the churches. That's another article that came out of the New York Times this past couple of weeks, talking about churches in Netherlands and all across Europe. They're closing by 2025. I think 1,000 Catholic churches will be closed in the Netherlands, and some of them are starting to be demolished, and people are saying, well, we don't want to be members of those churches, but we don't want you to demolish them either. So this is interesting kind of tension. Certainly, I hope we never have to have that kind of conversation. But the thing is, there are people who appreciate buildings, or institutions, or maybe not even care, but nevertheless, they won't go in those doors. And so that's the whole other set about wherever that space is located, how to invite people in, and maybe locating our sacred spaces in different places than we are accustomed to can help bring people in, and at times in those satellite situations that eventually bring them to a building that we may have. I mean, certainly the fabulous work that's happening down in Houston with Daniel O'Connell and others, and Christina and Robinson out in Albuquerque. So this is already happening. And also, I think there might be other people who had questions, although we're at 4 o'clock. So Amanda, you're saying, I'm feeling limited by expectations around form that feels inherent in the Sunday morning worship experience. When I've done things like call the directions in the Sunday service, for example, I feel like I'm putting a square peg in a round hole. I wish you'd say more about that. That's interesting. Oh, here's some other people, too. Is that kind of fighting against the space?
Or is that fighting against kind of what our expectations are, our kind of accumulated, liturgical tradition that anything that's going to be outside of that is going to feel a little unfitting at first, or not fitting well at first. I go to a church where we have a song leader who leads the singing, which when I first saw it, I'm not aware of very many UU churches that have song leaders. Somebody stands up in front of the congregation and leads them in song. And at first it felt, kind of round peggish and square hole, and kind of like, why is this church? But of course, as people have gotten, the rest of the congregation is very used to it, and it's very successful. So, I mean, I think pushing it, new liturgical elements like the directions, or, people thought Joys and Sorrows was, kind of weird at first too, and, so that's, all liturgical change, has that sense of discomfort in it, and setting up a study circle in a food court is going to feel real weird when you first do it.
Well, that's Lydia's question. Let's see. There we go. Well, Tom, it's 4:03.
Well, we started a little bit late, but I think we'll just end. Let's have last words from folks on what they think, what advice they would give their colleagues at this point around sacred space. So we'll start with you, Nicole, and Alan and David, and then a few words on future. I have a few words on future webinars.
Oh, great. Well, first of all, thank you for everyone who is attending that we can see and who are floating out there and who may be watching a recording of this. Again, it's our first one, and this is just a beginning conversation. When they invite me to do this, this is something I'm hoping to prepare for in February, but it's very much in my mind, again, academically, but then from my years of service in a variety of our parish churches, from a historical church in Summit, New Jersey, to a congregation founded out of the fellowship movement. And so as a historian, I say always the history, even if your church is 3 or 4 years old, then you have this whole rich wealth of what people thought that they were doing when they started that church and what they imagined, and then you can look at how people have received that. So, but 50 years, 100 years, looking at the different liturgical styles, different challenges, what people said at the dedication, how is that space being understood theologically, and also looking at it to see what the architecture or even the design of the worship space, if it's something that you are in only on Sunday and you have to set up and then break it down. I do pulpit supply all the time. Many of the congregations I preach for are like that. What beliefs are expressed by what you see in the front or in the middle of the room, however it's set up? What kind of ritual practices demarcates that time together and that are a regular part of that community? What do you see are the mission or goals that are reflected through that space, and how it's made to have boundaries that marks it as a different kind of space? So these are all things to think about. This comes from a scholar named Kildee, and she's done a lot of work thinking about studying about how churches over time have adapted all kinds of cultural, what we might say commercial, industrialized forms and brought them into the church. And so playing with that, but doing a really deep analysis of what you have and working with that, and then experimentation. I think so many of us, because of some of the congregants pushing back, are afraid to experiment, but there's ways to bring people on board so you can play and explore with that space and see how it can be sacred in different ways. Alan?
Yeah, when I first went into the ministry, I thought that what was really important was what I was saying. And I realized that's really, attention needs to be given to so much more. The context of the space really makes a tremendous difference. And it really does make a difference to bring in something. And I finally got to read some of the comments here. And Amanda, I appreciate you saying, I use a scarf and a chalice. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And my laughter was because I wasn't sure what else we use. I couldn't think of anything else, but I feel like there ought to be other things we can and should bring in addition to scarves that hang up. That was my own acknowledgement of, golly, I'm not really sure how best to do this
Yeah.
other than acknowledge that giving attention to the space we're in, as well as what we're bringing and where we're at. And really, our emotional presence often is more important than the specific words we're uttering. And I'll leave it there.
David.
Such an interesting conversation. It's fun to hear you guys. I hope it has been for you guys too. You know, the thought that I have is for folks who are in churches more than it is for folks who are thinking of what does sacred space look like outside of church. And to me, I feel like the great challenge here is to say we have a unique institution that has the potential to do within it things that can't be done anywhere else in American public life. And to me, the question is, as much as possible, what I want to keep in front of me is this question of what are we doing here that we can't do anywhere else? Because there are plenty of things that we did 25 years ago that other people do better now than we did. Our churches are never, on the whole, going to have a lecture series as good as you can get from TED on any day infinitely. So I think about that. In the space that we have, what can we do with it that can't be done anywhere else? And that's a real asset. You know, I'm very bright on the future of physical old-fashioned churches, as long as we really sort of seriously attend to how they stay healthy and strong and doing things that folks can't get elsewhere. And I think all of what we talked about has circled around that. What about you?
Great. Well, great, everybody. Thanks for this discussion, which I think is just the beginning of a much longer discussion. I hope that people who are fascinated or interested in this think about being a part of Nicole's group at the Institute, which will be in Asilomar in February of 2015. This webinar has been recorded and will be available through UUMA Connect until the end of time. And our next webinar. Oh, didn't you know that? Okay, yes. Till the end of time, Nicole Kirk, Alan Taylor, and David Schwartz will be talking about sacred space. Years from now, our grandchildren will be watching this. If they can find a computer that would run this kind of stuff. Next month, we're going to have a webinar with Executive Director of the UUMA, Don Southworth, and some of his partners who are putting together a Beyond the Call program on entrepreneurial ministry. And that's going to be a 2-year program on entrepreneurial ministry, but they're going to start with a webinar to get some of the concepts introduced and to get people's interest in that whetted. So you'll be looking for that in early July. And then in August, I think we're going to have a webinar on theme-based ministry. So look for that too. You'll find out the details of these all through the UUMA e-update that you get in your email list, and also at UUMA Connect. Allison, are you still there?
I am.
Anything you want to add at this point? Allison has done her best to manage this situation here, and we promise by the next time we do this, it'll be smoother and silkier. So until then, this is UUMA Connect webinar number 1.
From Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago.
Yes. Thank you very much. See you again.